Next up, we have my friend Gabriel Furshong. Um, he's going to be speaking about Fort Assinniboine and the 1896 Cree Deportation Act, and which reveals the story of the U.S. efforts to violently deport members of unrecognized Indigenous tribes to Canada. Gabe will examine why this dark chapter in Montana history is underrepresented and how we can bring this period of ethnic cleansing to light. Gabe is a writer and an elementary school teacher from Helena, where he lives with his wife and two children. He's a correspondent for Montana Quarterly since 2009, which is one of my favorite magazines after Montana, the Magazine of Western History. He has also written about history and politics for many national magazines, including The Nation, The American Prospect, and High Country News. A widely published poet, his collection Things Not to Be Said was a finalist for the 2023 Slavering Whole Press Chapbook Prize. I massacred that. Anyway, take it away, Gabe.
All right, thank you, Eve. Hi, everybody. I'm very glad to be here. Thanks to all of you for being here and attending this presentation, but being here in general. Very little is more important than history, and we can all agree on that. I want to start just by thanking Christine Brown at the Historical Society for the invitation to come and speak with you all. This presentation is based on an article that I wrote last fall on the Cree Deportation Act. And also, really, it's a story about the absence of the Cree Deportation Act in the current body of interpretation at Fort Assinniboine. And so part of what I tried to do in the article and part of what I tried to do in this presentation, and the two are very much aligned, is to ask, how we can do a better job of interpreting this place and remembering this part of Montana history. But two disclaimers. My own ability to perceive and share this history is really limited. I'm a 43-year-old white man from Helena, and so there's inherent limitations there. I'm not a trained historian, and so I'm sorry to disappoint you in that regard. But I do think this history is incredibly important. And years ago, when I was doing a lot of reporting for The Nation and other magazines about the Little Shell Tribe's quest for federal recognition, both administratively and legislatively, I spent a lot of time with Little Shell tribal historian Nicholas Vrooman, whose name came up earlier over lunch. And of course, many of us miss him dearly, but this was an area where he felt a great deal more scholarship was needed and a great deal more reporting, like popular reporting, so people can just learn about the story and be introduced to it for the first time. And so that's part of my objective here. And I assume that there are people in the audience who know much more about this history than I do. And so I look forward to hearing from you at the Q&A. So this is a picture that Nicholas Vrooman was very fond of and thought a lot about. This is Colonel Wilberforce Saunders, former Montana senator. This is Uptown Butte. And this is an encounter between him and some Indigenous people in Butte, most likely in the 1890s. Nicholas felt it was around 1892. And we'll be able to explore the significance of this photo as we go along. When I visited Fort Assinniboine last fall for the first time with my dad, who's here today, Joe Furshong, I had intended to explore the site and better understand the place where some of this story occurred, and kind of ground some of my reporting on this history in a physical place. And one of the first things I encountered was this National Register of Historic Places sign. There's many different National Register signs that dot, the landscape up there, and they all contain important history. But I was alarmed to, discover that the Cree Deportation Act isn't mentioned anywhere in this particular sign. And I found myself, as I thought more and more about the absence of that history, I found myself thinking a lot about these questions. And what I'll do is, this is my very weak attempt at an interactive presentation here. I printed off copies of the National Register sign, and there's only 10 copies here, but you can kind of take a peek and maybe just pay attention to what you notice about it'll come around here. What you notice about the text, and you can maybe read a little bit and listen as you go along. But this is the current text on the National Register sign. And like I said, there's a lot of important history mentioned here, and it's an incredibly difficult task to include all the history that you'd like to with a limited amount of space. Oops. So as I thought and read and reread that sign, I asked myself questions that you probably ask yourselves when you're reading history closely. How is power attributed? Who is mentioned by name? How are verbs and adjectives distributed in the text? Because that's where we can see opinions start to arrive. And sometimes we don't even notice that they've arrived, but we can feel their impact. And then this last question, what lies beyond the frame? Only so much can be included. And so what are we including and what are we excluding, intentionally or otherwise? And so I'm just going to draw out, some of the text and just bring some of those questions to bear on the text. Is this working? Can you guys hear me okay here? Okay, awesome. Here's a pretty remarkable image that I took notice of in the text. The first buildings were built so quickly that local Indian people said they rose magically out of the ground. And so this is an arresting image because Fort Assinniboine was built so quickly. You can imagine sort of this citadel. And so he's someone whose face and name we come away with. And there aren't that many faces and names that you leave Fort Assinniboine with. He's one that we're given. I mean, that's very intentional. We are meant to walk away thinking about, John J. Pershing, who acquired the nickname Blackjack Pershing for commanding Buffalo Soldiers, the 10th here at Fort Assinniboine. Here's another piece of text that I wanted to draw out. Here we're paying attention to how the activities of the soldiers are described and the purpose of the fort, how the purpose of the fort is described. Why did the US government build this fort? Why did they fund it? Well, the purpose is, protecting the citizens of Montana from the hostile incursions of Indian tribes dwelling in the region. Moreover, they were there to monitor various tribes who are mentioned by name here, deter raiding parties, and guard wagon trains. And so as I thought about those verbs, I came away with the impression of an enterprise that was entirely defensive, and there was no aggressive intent. And of course, I believe that to be inaccurate, and we'll explore that more here. But these are the verbs that are given to us to interpret kind of the activities of soldiers and officers at Fort Assinniboine. Soldiers, as we heard from our prior presenter, spent much of their time drilling, patrolling, constructing fort buildings, but these troops never saw major action. And I think I guess that's a matter of interpretation. I think they did see major action, certainly in the eyes of those who they were told to remove from northern Montana and along the Milk River corridor in particular. And so this image of a very sleepy, largely peaceful experience may have been true much of the time. It certainly wasn't true some of the time. And so what lies beyond the frame, there's a great deal that lies beyond the frame. Again, it's difficult to achieve a synthesis and a summary that tells a whole story or a true story. And the Cree Deportation Act and the Milk River clearances are absent. That lies beyond the frame at this point in time at Fort Assinniboine. So let's let's look a little bit at what did happen there. And again, I'm not an expert. I know, I guess I know what I know, and some of you can help me understand what I don't know. In reading Métis and the Medicine Line, a remarkable text, and I'm sure some of you have read it, I encountered this story about Charles Trechy, who was a leader of Métis settlement along the Milk River. This plea was included in a report by an officer at Fort Assinniboine. And in December of 1879, Charles Trechy traveled to Fort Assinniboine to basically plead for space, plead for some level of accommodation, and plead that his people would be able, his neighbors, his friends, his family, would be able to remain settled along the Milk River and earning a livelihood for years to come. The reason why his plea was so urgent is because Trechy and other Indigenous people in Montana at the time, were not enrolled at a tribe that was federally recognized. They had not been party to a treaty in which they were able to reserve lands for use by their people in perpetuity. Or if they were party to a treaty, their name was not listed on federally recognized enrollment logs. And so in a sense, and we heard this from a speaker earlier this afternoon, Trechy and his family and his neighbors, in a sense, lived in no man's land. They weren't welcome in white society and white communities, but at the same time, they had no legal right to live on the Fort Belknap Reservation, for example. And so he understood that their ability to remain in Montana was very tenuous. I don't know if you know the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, but I often think about this quote when I think about the violence that exists throughout history. And it certainly applies in this case, the violence that was brought to bear on Cree people and Métis people and Chippewa people along the Milk River corridor in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, and even into the 1900s. Never in history has violence been initiated by the oppressed. And it's interesting to think about this quote, and the more I think about it, the more complex it becomes. And certainly we would all have diverse opinions about what exactly this quote means. But what I think about is I think about, the Red River Rebellion in 1869 and how that largely peaceful rebellion near present-day Winnipeg was precipitated by Canadian surveyors who were asserting a legal claim to lands that had been lived on by Métis people for a very long period of time. And so that was the violence that initiated, the Red River Rebellion. So that's just one example. You could apply the same sort of framework to the 1885 rebellion in Saskatchewan. What's interesting is that when we take care not to read history as inevitable, we have to stop and really think about what could have occurred, what could have happened that didn't happen. And it's remarkable to recall that Louis Riel, after taking refuge in the United States after the Red River Rebellion, he sought to find a land base, to establish a land base. He and many others fought to establish a land base for Métis people and Indigenous people who were not federally recognized through peaceful means. And in this case, this is a good example, the delivering of this petition in 1880 to General Nelson Miles at Fort Keogh. So this is what, this could have happened. This petition could have been recognized as legitimate by the United States. But on May 20th, the following spring, in 1881, Commissioner of Indian Affairs Hiram Rice rejected the petition, and you can see his logic for rejecting the petition. And so there are there's obvious, racism here, and there's obvious xenophobia. These people are not Americans, and they're, racially inadequate. And so for these reasons, we cannot recognize their petition to remain here and establish their lives here for the long haul and raise future generations here. And so you can see the amount of time that passes here between this declaration and, one of, not the first clearance, but one of the first clearances along the Milk River corridor. This is Captain Jacob Klein, filed a report with the post adjutant and reported the burning of 90 shacks belonging to foreign Indians and half-breeds along the Milk River. And these were Charles Trechy's people. These were the people for whom he advocated peacefully and at some risk to himself to say, we've been here, we belong here, we'd like to remain here. The following year, another clearance along the Milk River corridor focused on removing Cree people and Métis people from northern Montana. And in this case, the report is quite precise. Soldiers burned 23 houses, 33 cabins, 38 log huts, and 36 other buildings along Rock Creek, which is near present-day Hindale. It's a tributary of the Milk River. It's interesting to me that Klein specifically noted that many of those homes were abandoned in great haste. And he reported being able to see people fleeing north. And some of these terms, huts and cabins and shacks in the previous, you wonder how many homes were there, how many families were affected. In total, these clearances certainly affected hundreds of families, over the years. It would take a great deal more scholarship to actually create an inventory of, and to estimate how many families could have been impacted by these cyclical clearances that occurred, and that Fort Assinniboine enabled, and that Fort Assinniboine was built. I mean, that was part of the purpose of the fort. Gabriel Dumont, after fleeing Canadian authorities in 1885, he returned to Montana, and he was fairly quickly captured by a detachment of soldiers from Fort Assinniboine, and he was brought to Fort Assinniboine and briefly held at the guardhouse there, not the current guardhouse that's on site, but a previous one. The current guardhouse was built after Gabriel Dumont, after 1885. But Gabriel Dumont, much like Louis Riel and Charles Trechy, was someone who at times sought to resolve conflict through peaceful means, and obviously also at times took up arms like Riel. But in the mid to late 1880s, Dumont becomes an advocate for the Métis people in Montana, the Dakotas, and in southern Canada. And this is what he had to say about the people that he met. And in 1887, he specifically rode a several hundred-mile circuit around Montana, even down into northern Wyoming, and his intention was to describe what the lives of his countrymen, as it were like. And his report is that it's increasingly desperate. There is no safe space for these people to live. If you are Indigenous and you don't have the right to live on lands that have been reserved by tribal citizens, then you have nowhere to be. And so what ends up happening, and this was another photograph that Nicholas Vrooman used often in his presentations, is you saw, urban Indian communities growing and expanding outside of Butte, outside of Great Falls, Helena, Havre, Lewistown, other places where people are eking out a living, but eking out a very difficult living that is less and less independent and more dependent. And so you can see how we get to the Cree Deportation Act of 1896. White society is increasingly uncomfortable with these indigenous urban communities. And community leaders within these communities are increasingly vocal about the fact that something needs to be done. And occasionally I hear echoes, and these are very different issues, but occasionally I hear echoes of these voices in newspapers from this era, 1880 and 1890, in discussions of unsheltered people in our communities today. Like, the level of anger that people have about unsheltered people is really remarkable. And it's a very complex problem to solve. But when I think about the anger that I witnessed in the newspaper in Helena around unsheltered people, I think, oh, right. Well, that's somewhat similar to what we might have seen in 1890s here. So this is the language of the Cree Deportation Act. Here you see an excerpt from a letter to Secretary of War Daniel Lamont from U.S. Attorney Albert Weed, based in Montana. And by this time there had been a clamor for very public clamor for the removal of Cree people from Montana for years, all through the early 1890s. And I'll show you some examples of newspaper stories here in a moment. One thing that I think many of you are already familiar with, but is worth pointing out, and this gives me a chance to use my fancy pointer here, is, which I was hoping I would get a chance to do, is that, in the text of the legislation, this is how, indigenous peoples are described. This is the target of the removal: refugee, Canadian, Cree, Indian. So there's several qualifiers there that make this politically possible to achieve. These people are not American. They are Canadian. They came from someone else originally. They were never here originally. They are refugees here. They need to be returned to somebody else's responsibility. And the perception of indigenous peoples as dependent is embedded in this language. So orders to begin ethnic cleansing, are handed down immediately after the legislation passes. And another thing I'd like to point out here is the expediency. I'm going the wrong way here. Wow. Ooh, my goodness. Bear with me. There we go. Press the wrong button. Is here in this telegraph from Montana Senator Thomas Smith to Governor John Rickards, from Washington, D.C. to Montana, is this emphasis on expediency. We've got to get moving because the people who voted for us are upset, and they want to see indigenous people removed from their communities. It needs to happen immediately. And so by June 1896, John Pershing is leading Buffalo Soldiers around Montana and visiting Havre, Great Falls, Butte, and rounding up Cree people and Métis people and indigenous people, and putting them in pens, and then affecting their travel into rail yards, putting them on rail cars, and removing them to Canada, taking them to the 49th parallel. This is a picture of Little Bear and his followers awaiting deportation in northern Montana. And these are some newspaper articles about the deportation, which was widely reported in Montana. I mean, there was an eagerness to see this happen. And there almost needs to be a kind of a trigger warning here, because the language is so foul in some of these articles. you know, I won't read it for you, but I'll welcome you to read it if you wish and give you a moment to kind of digest the way these activities were being discussed in the press. Would you like me to read it or? Oh, okay. Well, a couple things that stand out to me is that this is a piece from the Glasgow newspaper, and this writer says that the Indians have preyed upon the people of northern Montana since the Cree Rebellion, a reference to 1885, stealing horses, killing cattle, and putting ranchmen to no end of trouble by their depredations. This has been a drawback only second to predatory animals, to those engaged in the stock raising industry. Once they are removed, this will be a riddance of poor rubbish. And so the intent, thank you, the intent to dehumanize is really profound. And that's something that Paulo Freire talks a lot about as well, is this persistent effort to dehumanize, which enables all sorts of awful things to occur. Once you've dehumanized someone, you can do about anything to them. So, why am I using the term ethnic cleansing? I suppose it's because, a mentor of mine, Nicholas Vrooman, that was the term that he selected, and it's the most accurate term to use. The Congress chose the word deportation for a reason. It's quite tame by comparison. Ethnic cleansing is what occurred here. This is the definition that is the working definition from the European Union right now. Rendering an area ethnically homogenous by using force or intimidation to remove from a given area persons of another ethnic or religious group. The legislation specifically targeted Cree peoples and then ultimately targeted a wide range of Indigenous peoples who were unrecognized and unwilling to live on the reservation. And this is a term that I think needs to be used at the end for interpretation at Fort Assinniboine. So, a question as we wind down here and approach our Q&A, a question that comes to me is, where does this history live today? Like, where are we going to learn about the Cree Deportation Act and the Milk River clearances? Where can we go? Well, you could go to Métis on the Medicine Line, where it is treated to a certain extent. You could find it in Nicholas Vrooman's tome, which is out of print. You can find it in Montana Quarterly. And copies of that are on sale in the bookstore, I understand. But you can't find it very many places at all. Now, it lives in Gerald Gray's heart, chairman of the Little Shell tribe, because his ancestors took shelter in the Teton, to avoid deportation. And so it certainly lives with him. And it certainly lives with the descendants of some of these individuals on the Rocky Boy Reservation. Little Bear is here on the left, Chief Little Bear, because they never stopped fighting for a land base. They never stopped fighting for space where they could be and where they could thrive. And in 1915, they did finally achieve reserved lands for their people, and those lands were carved out of the historic footprint of Fort Assinniboine in 1915. This is a 1915 photograph of the negotiation to establish the Rocky Boy Reservation. This is Frank Linderman over here. This is one of these two gentlemen is the editor of the Great Falls Tribune. And these are, Bowles. Yes, thank you. That is correct. Yeah. Yeah. My notes are hidden behind the slides, so thank you for that. Yeah. This gentleman is the interpreter, Raspierre, I think is his last name. And this is in front of the Placer Hotel in Helena. And certainly the history lived here in 2019 when the Little Shell tribe, which includes people of Cree origin and Chippewa peoples and a mixed heritage people who belong to this tribe. And this is the moment where they raised their flag in front of the Montana Capitol building after they were federally recognized, much like Little Bear, never having give up the fight. And so the history lives with them. But of course, we have to be very aware of where history is not, like where this history is not present. And it's not present on the Fort Assinniboine Preservation Association website. Here's a timeline of major events at the fort. Remember that word major? Well, what would you consider a major event, having considered these Milk River clearances? Do they belong on this timeline? Certainly they do. And it's not present on the National Register of Historic Places sign. And so I think that needs to be fixed. Now, I think that was Christine Brown's design in reaching out to me to present. And I think her leadership in trying to improve interpretation at the site really deserves to be commended. And I also want to end with this slide, which is a quote, and a difficult quote to read, I think, from Ron Vandenboom, who's the current chair of the board for the Fort Assinniboine Historic Preservation Association. And I spoke to him yesterday. He couldn't be here today. I was hoping he would. And he has acknowledged some really significant problems with interpretation at the site. He wants to fix those problems and is hoping to work with the Historical Society and others to find funding to improve interpretation. And so he's been very honest and open about the shortfalls and interested in improving interpretation at the site. And that's it. Thank you so much for your time.